is Brenda Lopez-Cepero.
And I'm Julian Otero.
And our PowerPoint focuses on a psychoanalytical approach, The Descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar A. Poe.
We hope you'll enjoy.
In the introduction into A Descent into the Maelstrom by Edgar A. Poe, we have the narrative of a lone survivor who survives a deadly and dangerous whirlpool. The psychoanalytical approach focuses on real-life fears and trauma in the author's life. Many times, details in the story have to do with the actual life of the author and memories that they have or fears that they have lived through. Many times, these psychoanalytical approaches help theorists to interpret texts in ways that the author many times didn't intend to. Here I have a quote from the article, "What is Psychoanalytical Criticism in Literature?" And it is stated that the psychoanalytic criticism adopts the method of reading employed by Freud and later theorists to interpret texts. It argues that literary texts like dreams express the secret unconscious desires and anxieties of the author, that a literary work is a manifestation of the author's own neurosis. So many times the characters in the story or the details that happen, the events that happen in the story have to do with the author's real life. The psychoanalytic approach or theory was birthed somewhere between the 19th and 20th century by Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud. This approach was created as a unique way of analyzing his patients and has since been used to analyze countless texts and stories. Really, when using the psychoanalytic approach, readers focus on the unintended or underlying hidden meanings that the stories have. And it is important to note that the actions determined or the events that happen often have to do with the pre-stored ideas that the author has. Now we will talk about a little bit more about Sigmund Freud. Born May 6, 1856, and died on the 23rd of September, 1939, Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis, which, like stated, was a method for evaluating and treating patients using dialogue between a patient and a psychoanalysis. Some of his most prolific works are on the theories of id, the Oedipus complex, ego and superego, defense mechanisms, and repression. A little bit about his life. He qualified as a doctor of medicine at the University of Vienna in 1881, where he would spend most of his life. He was appointed a docent in neuropathology after completing his habilitation in 1885, where he became a professor in 1902. Freud lived and worked in Vienna, but unfortunately in 1938, he had to leave because of Nazi rule. He then left Austria to escape Nazi persecution. He died in exile in the United Kingdom in 1939. And although Freud is long gone, his theories surrounding psychoanalysis remain an influential element within psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, and across the humanities. The story begins with a seemingly old man telling a story which comes with a plot twist. The old man is in fact not old at all. At this point, he explains how it came to be that his hair changed from its natural full color to white, all in the matter of an unfortunate day out at sea. The protagonist explains that this was the result of frightening circumstances he found himself in. He recalled how 3 years ago, as a youngster, he would go out with his 2 other brothers, out to where no other fisherman dared go in fear of the powerful and destructive Maelstrom. This meant for the brothers a high-risk, high-reward scenario, as many times the fish beyond the Maelstrom were bigger and more plentiful due to other fishermen being afraid of dying and being swept away and destroyed. One day, the worst possible thing happened, and a storm hit the brothers. The seemingly old man and his brothers had to look for cover in the boat to survive. However, the strength of the storm caused one of the old man's brothers to fly off with the mast he was tied to and caused his unfortunate death. After, the protagonist found himself clutching onto a ringboat for safety alongside his brothers, where they realize how little the chances of surviving actually are. As they begin to be caught up in the Maelstrom, the man figures out by observing the things around him and critically thinking the best chances for survival. In the end, the man's other brother also perishes, paralyzed by fear, whereas by luck and a little bit of thinking, the man escaped with his life. Though now the stress from the whole 6-hour ordeal had changed his hairs on his head from its usual rich black color to a ghastly white. These occurrences could lead the reader to infer certain things about the life of Poe. And yes.
Now, in terms of psychoanalysis, the renowned neurologist Sigmund Freud asserted that people's behavior is affected by their unconscious. The notion that human beings are motivated and even driven by desires, fears, needs, and conflicts of which they are unaware of. Now, this has a way of playing in Edgar Allan Poe's titular creation. Within the story, where the Maelstrom beast can be interpreted as a symbol of which the author's fears and how he perceives them to be much bigger than himself. Additionally, when regarding the contact the Maelstrom makes with the man's ship, it is sunk because of the beast's force and how the author's fears could often make him feel like he is losing his foundation. When the Maelstrom had contact with the ship, of course, it sank it, and thus the sailors were left with nothing to stand on. They were left with no solid ground. And in a metaphorical way, this can also be applied to the author's life. When he was facing a situation in which he indeed found himself afraid, it felt like he was probably losing the foundation on which he stood. Nonetheless, when him and his brothers are left stranded, they look forward to be able to make it back to safety once the boat resurfaces without having to suffer through the Maelstrom again. But their plan fails, and they are once again left at the mercy of the terrifying beast. In other words, when the contact between the ship and the Maelstrom was made, the ship was not broken, it was sank. And in due time, it was able to resurface again. This time, the brothers were left stranded, and once the ship resurfaced, they decided to make a plan so that way they wouldn't have to encounter the beast again. Because of course, one time they were lucky and they were able to survive, they did not count themselves lucky enough for a second time. However, the plans were never able to go through because of a faulty watch, and eventually they were left at the beast's mercy. This, of course, could symbolize the author not being able to escape his terrors from life and having to face them whether he wants to or not. In addition, when the characters face the beast, they find that he is not just terrifying, but he's also beautiful. Meaning how in the face of fear, the author finds beauty in it. And yes, that can be seen. I mean, he goes through a fearful situation, and although most of us think that it is mostly horrible, however, as you're in it, you can find beauty and even good things in it that can actually help you grow as a person. However, this is notwithstanding how the beast still leaves the character and his brothers in danger, and they must find the way to escape the Maelstrom's whirlpool. In it, we are still in the middle of a story in which the characters are still in a very deep conflict, which of course can be a very big threat to their lives. Now, Freud had actually established various ways of psychoanalyzing literature. And other than Eros and Thanatos, another popular one which is also based off Greek mythology is the Oedipus complex, in which a character is sexually attracted to one or both of his parents. Another way of psychoanalyzing literature is also one of denial. However, the one that was most present in the story A Descent into the Maelstrom was the one of Eros and Thanatos. Now, according to Freud, two basic impulses act on every human being. On the one hand, there is the life drive, which he calls Eros, and on the other hand, there is the death drive, or Thanatos, which was stated by Paulo Rodriguez. This can be observed in the story's protagonist and his brothers, because while under the threat of imminent death, the protagonist latches onto a smaller object, noticing how they are attracted slower than larger ones. Which to explain, when they were being faced with the Maelstrom directly, the protagonist and the brothers started reacting differently. The protagonist, which will soon turn into the old man, he started thinking under the pressure, in which he literally started seeing how the bigger objects were attracted with greater force towards the Maelstrom and ultimately being destroyed, whereas the smaller ones were attracted at a slower pace. And so he had a desire to live, which of course prompted him to latch himself onto a smaller object. Whereas the brothers, they actually took a different route. The brothers, under the threat of imminent death, decided to let themselves succumb to it. They didn't choose to fight for their lives. They had no desires to live. They simply chose to accept their fate of death. The protagonist ultimately lets them. And this can often mean how the author is often faced with tragedy, but lets himself succumb to it most of the time. But if he were to choose to think critically under the pressure, he would find a way of escape. Moreover, although the protagonist was indeed saved, he had progressively aged at a very quick pace. Whereas at the beginning of the day, he was a young man with great strength. By the end of it, he had been left an old, aging man that was weak. And this goes to show how it's a demonstration of how psychoanalysis gives us knowledge about the precariousness, fragility, and expiration of the human being, as stated by Carlos Ray. Additionally, this may also symbolize how fear has often left the author worse than before, but not facing it would have meant losing a part of him, like the character who would have lost his life, like his brothers. The author Edgar Allan Poe used writing as a form to express his tragedies of his life. And based on the story, it can be seen how many of them had to deal with the subconscious fears of his mind, and of course, having to face them. Now, in conclusion, based on the reading, it can be inferred how, through the use of writing, the author is projecting his fears within the story. Examples of these being the Maelstrom beast, the shipwreck, and death. In addition to how his own life experiences are what helped in the creation of this story, and how they are an in-depth exploration of his own subconscious using Freudian psychoanalysis, as well as how the characters are in the whirlpool and they must find a way to survive. It is the author's life experiences that help him navigate his own fears and allow him to find beauty within them. There are many authors such as Edgar Allan Poe in the story, A Descent into the Maelstrom, that use events, objects, and even characters to reveal past experiences and fears pertaining to himself. And of course, this story is no exception. This is what, in a symbolic way, he does. He is literally showing bits and pieces of his subconscious and how he would act based upon them through the use of characters, actions, and even unexplainable beasts. And now, to end this presentation, I would like to end off with a quote, which is found at the bottom left, at least for me, that says that the scariest monsters are the ones that lurk within our souls, which was written by none other than Edgar Allan Poe himself.